everybody, welcome back to my little shop. On this channel you have heard me talk a number of times about this limiter style of cutter block. It's an excellent cutter block for many different shop sizes, primarily because you can mill almost an infinite variety of different profiles simply by exchanging the relatively inexpensive high-speed steel knives. Now, 99 times out of 100, when you install these knives properly, you'll get an excellent finish. But every now and then, especially with a cope and stick cut, you'll have to make a minor adjustment in order to tighten up the joint a little bit. What I'd like to do today is talk about the proper method for installing the knives in this block, and I'd like to talk about a couple of different approaches for tweaking or adjusting the fit if you ever have to. There are a number of different limiter style heads out there. This is your classic cylindrical shaped block. You can get them a larger diameter and a fair bit taller depending on what work you're up to. You can also get limiter style panel raisers. I have a video, and I'll post a link to it in the description below, where I talk about the two different limiter style panel raising heads that Whitehill makes. This is another interesting style of limiter head. This is what is often called a cone head. This is on a 30-degree angle, and this is great if you do a lot of angled milling but don't have a tilting spindle on your shaper. For this video though, we're going to keep it simple and use this very standard 96 by 55 millimeter block from Whitehill Tools. But the concepts and principles I'm conveying here are portable to all the different limiter style blocks out there. Okay, so I've talked about this before on the channel, but it's worth repeating because it's a vital step in getting good results from your limiter cutter head. You want to make sure that the block is very clean. So you'll need to remove the wedge blocks. You want to brush down the block and make sure there isn't any pitch or sawdust anywhere on the block that'll forbid a good fit. What I find the best tool for doing this with is your wife's toothbrush. Very nice coarse bristles, but since they're plastic, they're unlikely to scrape the oxide coating off the block and encourage rust. Okay, so this block is nice and clean. We're going to move right on to installing the knives. We're going to configure this for a counter or anti-clockwise rotation. And since the limiters always lead the knives, we're going to put a limiter here, and a knife here, and a knife here. And just a quick tip to help hold the knives in place before you put the wedge block in, you just put a little side pressure on here, and that helps to hold the knives. They're less inclined to fall out on you. Okay, so the knives and limiters are in there loosely, and if you noticed, without the wedge blocks firmly tightened up, there's a tiny little bit of movement in the knives, and this is just due to the clearance that's required to get the knives on the pins. If it were a piston fit, it would be impossible to get them on there. Now, the easy way to get the pins positioned the same on both sides of the block is to simply hold the block by the knife and let gravity push the pins to the same side of the hole in the knives. So if you imagine that this is the pin in the block and this is the hole in the knife, this clearance here is greatly exaggerated just to help illustrate the point. But you can see how pulling the pin and the block to one side of the hole almost has a bit of a self-centering effect due to the complementary shapes. And if you do this the same on both sides of the block, your knife alignment will also be the same. So let's do that and get these knives snug down. Now, if you do it this way, 99% of the time the finish and the fit, if you're using a cope and stick set of knives, will be absolutely perfect. But every now and then you'll have to make an adjustment. Now, I tested this fit off camera and it's actually perfect. So what I'm going to do is artificially adjust the two knives a little bit out of whack, and then we'll walk through the process of how you can adjust them. Okay, so let's say you have installed the knives and limiters in the head properly. You've run a couple of test runs, and your cope and stick or your tongue and groove isn't as snug as you want it to be. It's time to take a look at the knives and see if you can find the culprit. There's a number of different ways you can go about doing this. A lot of big commercial shops, for example, that are running molders with serrated heads, they want to make sure everything is perfect before they even put them in the machine. They'll have what they call a setting stand, but a smaller shop won't have something like that. But this little humble setup will do a great job. This is a magnetic base indicator holder, and this is a very simple indicator. You can get away with a very inexpensive set. I mean, the verification process that you need to do this doesn't require NASA level precision, so a very humble setup like this will do just fine. You can have a couple different problems with your cope and stick fitment. You can have either the cutters that are cutting the groove are cutting a groove that's a little bit too wide, or the cutters that are cutting the tongue are cutting the tongue a little bit too narrow. Can't happen the other way around. So if you're unsure who the culprit is, what I like to do is test the groove cutters first, just simply because it's a little bit easier logistically to indicate on the spike that cuts the groove. So let's zoom you in a little bit so you can see the dial better, and we'll take a look at these knives. Okay, so you notice I'm doing this on a granite reference plate. Now, if you know that your spindle is running true and perfect, it's arguably better and easier to do this right in the machine. Now, if you're uncertain and you're troubleshooting and trying to figure out what's going on, a setup like this allows you to isolate the effects of the block from any effects the machine spindle may be having. Now, if you're interested in learning more about how to check and verify your spindle in your machine, just put a comment down below and I'll do up a quick video on that. So I've deliberately offset the two cutters on either side of the block. So let's take a look and see what the indicator says. We're focusing on the height of the groove cutters at this time, but the same process can be done if you're worried about the limits being off, the projection being off as well. Okay, so that one, we'll double check it. It's just a little bit more than a thousandth of an inch. It doesn't matter right now what the dial is saying. It just matters that the two sides are the same. So let's take a look at the other side. I want to make sure that the indicator is on the exact same place on the knives. Okay, so that's about 8,000. So there's quite a bit of difference between the two of them. What I do when I run into this is I loosen up the wedge blocks so that they're definitely snug, but they're no longer tight. And what works for me is just to use the plastic handle of the T-wrench that comes with the block and just tap it down until this knife reads the same as the other one. That's just right on a thousandth of an inch. So let's snug this up and take a look at it. Okay, just to make sure it didn't move when we snugged it up, let's take a look. So we're just a little bit over a thou. And we are right on a thou. So we're talking about a quarter of a thousandths difference between the two of them. You can mess with them and get them a little tighter than that, but that will be absolutely fine. So at this point, what I would do is I would run the knives and see how you make out. If you still don't get good results, I would repeat the exact same process for the tongue cutters. Now at this point, if the problem is solved, it's a good idea to take a few minutes and measure the tongue and groove with a set of calipers, just so you know what you're aiming for if you run into the same problem next time you run the knives. If you still don't get good results, then you have to start looking at your machine. Now that's a little bit too much for one video, but there are a few quick checks you can do. Okay, what I would do is check the easiest and simplest stuff first. Make sure that the block is nice and clean, paying special attention to the upper and lower flanges, but also make sure that the bore is nice and clean as well. If that all checks out, verify that these same upper and lower flanges are nice and flat and not dented or mushroomed up in any way, because that can certainly be enough to set the block out of whack and prevent it from running true. For example, this is my combi head, and dropped something on it, just barely hit this flange here and mushroomed up a little tiny section of it. It was almost, it was very difficult to see, but it was still enough to send it out of whack, and the results just weren't as good as they used to be. So I took it into a machine shop. You see it doesn't have the oxide coating on here anymore, and they just took a few thou off and fixed it up, and it's been fine ever since then. But similarly, I would also check the spindle to make sure it's clean and in good running conditions. This is one of the spindles from the big Wadkin EQ shaper, and this flat area right here, that's where the block sits, and it needs to be flat without any mushroomed up areas. Similarly, if the spindle is removable from your machine, certainly a good idea to make sure that the shaft itself is nice and clean, but also the corresponding socket in the machine. Let's pay special attention, of course, to this flat area right here, because this is where it actually mates with the quill of the machine, and it has to be nice and flat, clean, without any burrs or mushroomed up areas as well. These are all a little bit different, but I think you get the idea. So if your machine is otherwise in good working order, these checks will typically solve all your problems. Well, that wraps this one up, folks. I hope you found it informative. If you're interested in some more details on how you can check and verify that your shaper and shaper spindle are running true, put a comment down below and I'll throw together a video on that. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.